At the dinner table, my parents said, "Your sister's pregnant? She gets your college fund. You can work. It builds character." I just said, "Okay." I even hugged my mom. Then I went upstairs, and my phone lit up with a bank alert. Someone downstairs screamed my name. My name is Camille. I'm 22. I grew up in a split-level house in a quiet part of Connecticut with my parents and my older sister. And for most of my life, I believed we were a normal family with normal problems. We weren't rich. My dad managed a regional office for an insurance company, and my mom did the books for a dental practice 2 towns over. We took one vacation a year, usually somewhere within driving distance, and my parents were the kind of people who clipped coupons out of habit even after they didn't strictly need to anymore. The fund at the center of all of this wasn't something my parents built. It came from my grandfather, my mom's father, a quiet man named Elias, who'd spent 30-some years running a hardware store before he sold it, and retired with more money than anyone in the family had expected. When I was 9, not long before he died, he sat me down at his kitchen table with a legal pad and explained, in the plain, unhurried way he explained everything, that he was setting aside money for my education, not my sister's, mine. He was very specific about that, and even at 9, I understood it wasn't an accident of favoritism so much as a decision he'd clearly thought through. "Your sister's going to be fine," he told me. "She's got your mother's charm. You're going to need this more than charm." I didn't fully understand what he meant then. I understood it a lot better by the time I was 22, sitting at that same kind of table, minus my grandfather, listening to my father tell me the fund he'd set aside for my education was going to my sister instead. I just said, "Okay." I hugged my mother, and I went upstairs to do what I'd already quietly done 4 months earlier, which was make sure there was nothing left in that account for anyone to take. My sister Delphine is 4 years older than me, and growing up, the difference in how we were treated was never dramatic enough to point to directly. It was smaller than that. It was cumulative. When I was 7, she wanted piano lessons, and my parents found the money for a used upright and a teacher who came twice a week. I asked for art class around the same time and was told we'd revisit it the following year. We never did. At 16, my sister totaled her first car, borrowed from my mother. I heard my parents' voices low in the kitchen that night, my father mentioning the deductible. In the morning, nobody mentioned it. That same year, I asked about SAT prep, an expensive but well-regarded program at my school. My mother said we didn't have the funds that month, that I should use the free library materials instead, which I did, diligently. That same month, a deposit for my sister's wedding venue came out of what my mother called the emergency fund. The wedding never happened. Delphine's engagement ended 8 months later, and the deposit was never mentioned again. I started keeping a private document that year, a screenshot folder I called, with the flat honesty of a 16-year-old family financial history. I didn't know what I was going to do with any of it. I only knew I didn't want to be in a position later of not being able to prove what I already suspected. None of this means my childhood was miserable. My parents weren't cruel, not in any way that would have looked obvious from the outside. My mother made my lunch every morning. My father came to every cross-country meet, even the ones an hour and a half away, even in the rain. I loved them, and in most of the ways that mattered day to day, I believe they loved me too. It's a strange thing, growing up quietly aware that you are the reliable one in a family that has never once had to test that reliability, because you've never given them a reason to. The discovery happened 4 months before that dinner, on a Sunday afternoon by accident. I wasn't looking for anything. I'd come over to babysit my nephew, Delphine's son Miles, who was 2 and only napped if someone stayed in the room. My parents were out running errands. My sister was at a doctor's appointment, and I was on the couch with Miles asleep against my chest, scrolling my own phone with the sound off. My mother's laptop sat open on the coffee table, still logged into everything, the way it always was. A notification lit up, a preview from a family group chat created years earlier, back when my grandmother's health was declining. Most of the family had stopped using it once things settled. Apparently, my mother and her sister, my Aunt Renata, still did. I don't fully know why I picked up the laptop instead of letting the screen go dark. Some part of me had been waiting for years for a piece of proof to present itself. When it did, I didn't hesitate. My aunt had asked how my parents planned to handle the fun situation, now that Delphine's pregnancy had become official news. My mother's response stopped my breathing. "Camille won't bite us on it," she'd written. "She never does. Honestly, I think she might even offer to help pick out furniture for the nursery." My aunt replied with a laughing emoji, and underneath, "She's always been the easy one, hasn't she?" My mother responded with a simple, agreeing yes. I read those messages 6 or 7 times, checking each time that I wasn't misreading it. Miles stirred once and settled again, and I was grateful he didn't wake up, because I didn't want him to see my face. It wasn't fury yet. It was closer to recognition, the hollow feeling of watching a suspicion you've carried for years get confirmed in writing, with your own name spelled correctly at the top of it. I closed the tab and set the laptop back where I'd found it. My parents came home 40 minutes later with no idea anything had changed. I left an hour after that, same as any other Sunday. Except on the drive home, I stopped at a red light on Route 9 and sat through the entire cycle without moving until the car behind tapped its horn. I didn't cry that night, and I didn't confront anyone. What I did, once I was back at my apartment, was open my laptop and start reading about custodial accounts under Connecticut law. I want to explain something about Connecticut's custodial account law, because it becomes the hinge the first half of this story turns on. My grandfather had set the account up as a UTMA, a Uniform Transfers to Minors Act account, with my father named as custodian, since I was a minor at the time. Under Connecticut law, that control terminates automatically once the beneficiary turns 21. I read the actual statute text that night. The word the law uses isn't may, it's shall. I was already 21. I'd turned 21 that August. 4 months before I found the message. Whatever my parents believed they still controlled, they legally didn't. My father was still listed as custodian only because nobody had ever formally updated the account. I called my grandfather's old attorney the next morning, a careful man named Bertram Voss, who I remembered vaguely from the funeral. He remembered me too, and when I explained what I'd found, he was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to make a decision today," he told me, "but if I were you, I'd want to know exactly where things stood before anyone else got the idea to make that decision for me. I'd need identification, a copy of my grandfather's original letter of intent, still folded into the back of an old journal, and I'd need to go to the bank in person. There was no legal requirement to tell anyone else first. It was mine to do quietly." I sat with it for 2 weeks before I stopped hoping I was wrong and drove to the bank. I went on a Saturday morning, the first appointment the branch had. I brought my ID, my grandfather's letter, and a printout of the statute section, which in hindsight was probably unnecessary. The banker who helped me, a woman about my mother's age named Priya, didn't need convincing. She confirmed my date of birth against the beneficiary information on file and told me plainly that I was correct. Custodianship had terminated the previous August. My father's name would remain listed unless I formally requested it removed, but functionally, as of that morning, he had no more access to that account than a stranger off the street. "Do you want to make any changes today?" she asked. I said yes. We opened a new account under my name alone and moved the full balance, $41,612 at the time, into it. I set up two-factor authentication tied to my own phone, not the landline my parents still had listed as a backup contact. I turned on login alerts for any device the system didn't recognize. I changed the password to something I generated and didn't write down anywhere, except in an encrypted note only I could access. Priya asked, almost as an aside while she typed, whether I wanted to close the old account entirely or leave it dormant. I asked what would happen if someone who used to have access tried to log into the dormant one. "Same alert system," she said, "tied to the account number, not to who currently held it." I told her to leave it open. Looking back, that was the moment the decision stopped being purely defensive and became something closer to a test. I wasn't only protecting the money, I was leaving a tripwire, wanting to know whether anyone would step on it. For a while, nothing happened. I mean that literally. I went back to my normal life. I was working as a paralegal at a small firm in New Haven at the time, saving for my LSAT prep the old-fashioned way, one paycheck at a time, and my family life continued exactly as it had before, at least on the surface. Sunday dinners when I could make them, my mother texting me recipes she thought I'd like, Delphine's pregnancy becoming more visible, more the center of every family conversation. In the ordinary way a first grandchild becomes the center of everything. I didn't bring up the group chat. I didn't ask my parents directly what their plans were for the fund. Some of that was strategic. Bertram had told me gently that the less I signaled about what I already knew, the more clearly I'd be able to see what they actually intended to do, uncomplicated by whatever performance might follow if they knew I was watching. But some of it, honestly, was just hope. A stubborn, embarrassing amount of hope that I was somehow wrong, or that even if the group chat message was real, my parents would still come to me when it mattered, would still treat the fund as a conversation rather than an announcement. There were nights I almost talked myself out of the whole thing. I'd think about how it would look if I was wrong, if I confronted my parents over an account transfer that turned out to be nothing, some other plan entirely. I'd think about Delphine, who I did love, about to have a baby with a man who'd recently lost his job, and I'd feel a version of guilt that had nothing to do with anything I'd actually done and everything to do with the exhaustion of being raised to always consider everyone else's need before your own. But then I'd remember the exact words, "She never does," and the guilt would recede, replaced by something steadier. 4 months passed this way. Then, on a Tuesday in late September, my mother called and asked if I could come for dinner that weekend. "We need to talk about something important," she said. "Delphine will be there too." I already knew. I drove to my parents' house that Saturday with the same navy folder sitting on the passenger seat where it had ridden 4 months earlier on my trip home from the bank, except this time I'd added to it a printed copy of the group chat screenshot, the bank's written confirmation of the transfer, and the highlighted statute page. I didn't plan to bring it out unless I needed to. I just wanted to know it was there. My mother answered the door and hugged me the way she always did, one hand briefly on the back of my head, her perfume the same as it had been my entire life, something floral and a little old-fashioned that she'd worn since before I was born. The house smelled like pot roast, my father's favorite, not mine, which I noticed and then made myself stop noticing. Delphine was already at the table when I came in, 7 months along now, her hand resting on the curve of her stomach in the unconscious way pregnant women do. She looked tired. She looked, if I'm honest, a little afraid, in a way that made something in my chest soften slightly, even though I already knew, by then, more or less exactly what this dinner was going to be. We made it through most of the meal on ordinary conversation. My mother asked about work. My father asked whether I'd started looking at LSAT prep courses yet, and I told him I had, which was true, and he nodded approvingly in the way he always did when I gave an answer that fit the version of me he was comfortable with. Delphine talked a little about the nursery, about paint colors, about a crib her friend was giving her secondhand. It was for about 40 minutes, almost exactly like every other Sunday dinner in that house for the last 22 years. Then my father set his fork down. He does this specific thing, has done it my whole life, where he lines the fork up carefully along the edge of the plate before he says something he's rehearsed. I'd seen him do it before difficult conversations with clients on speakerphone. I'd never had it aimed at me before. "Camille," he said, "we want to talk to you about something, and I want you to hear the whole thing before you react." I said okay, and I meant it as an instruction to continue, not as agreement to what whatever was coming, though I understood even as I said it how it would land. Your sister's situation has changed a lot this year, he continued. The wedding falling through, and now with the baby coming and Trevor's job. He paused, glanced at Delphine, who was looking down at her plate. It's been a lot. Your mother and I have been talking, and we think the right thing is for your education fund to go toward helping her and the baby get settled. You're already established. You have a job. You can work while you finish your degree. Plenty of people do. It builds character. My mother reached over and put her hand on top of mine on the table. You've always been so capable, sweetheart, she said. So independent. Delphine's never had that. She needs this in a way you just don't. Delphine still hadn't looked up. When she finally did, her eyes were wet, and she said quietly, Cam, I'll pay you back. I promise. Someday, I promise I will. I looked at my mother's hand on top of mine, and I looked at my father, who was watching me the way he watches weather reports before a storm, and I felt the folder sitting untouched in my bag by the front door, and I made a decision in that exact second that I still think about. Not a decision about the money. That decision had been made months earlier, but a decision about how tonight was going to go. Okay, I said. The table went quiet in a way that told me they'd braced for something else entirely. My mother's face did something complicated, relief layered under something that might have been surprise, or might have been the faint, unexamined discomfort of a fight not happening the way you'd planned for it. Thank you for understanding, my mother said. I know this isn't easy. Can I be excused? I asked. I have some reading to do before Monday. Delphine murmured her promise again as I stood, and I said nothing back to it, not because I didn't hear her, but because I didn't yet know what I believed about it. My mother stood and hugged me at the door of the dining room, the same hug as always, and whispered, the way she always did, I love you. I love you too, I said, and I meant it, which is a strange thing to be able to say honestly about a moment like that one, but I did. Love and boundaries had never, in my mind, needed to cancel each other out. I don't think anyone else in that house understood that distinction yet. I'm not sure they understand it now. Upstairs, in my old bedroom, I sat on the same faded comforter I'd had since high school and opened my banking app, not because I needed to check anything, but because I wanted to feel the number settle. $41,612. Still there. Still mine. My chest loosened in a way I hadn't expected it to. At 8:56, my phone buzzed against the comforter. Logan attempt failed. Unrecognized device. I sat very still. Through the floor, faint but unmistakable, I could hear the sound of a keyboard. Fast, then slower, then fast again. The particular rhythm of someone typing and retyping a password they were certain was correct. My father's voice, low, saying something to my mother I couldn't make out the words of, just the irritated shape of it. A second buzz. Failed attempt. One try remaining. The typing stopped. I heard my mother's voice now, sharper. Harold, what's wrong? I didn't move from the bed. I found to my own surprise that I wasn't afraid. I felt something closer to stillness, the specific quiet readiness of having already done everything there was to do months ago, and simply waiting now to see it land. A third buzz. Account locked for 24 hours. Then my father's voice, no longer low, cracking up through the floorboards with a clarity the first two hadn't had. What do you mean I can't get in? I'll call them. It was after 9. Customer service had closed at 6. I heard the dial tone anyway, then the automated voice, then his voice rising over it. Then my mother, quieter than either of them had been, asking a question I could just barely make out. Harold, maybe Camille knows something. She's the one on the account now, isn't she? Since she turned 21? Silence. Then his voice entirely changed. She's what? Something slammed against the desk downstairs. His laptop, maybe, or his hand. And then he called my name up the stairs, and I smoothed the comforter under me, stood up, counted to 10 in my head the way I'd taught myself to do years earlier before difficult conversations, and walked down. My father was standing at the kitchen table, his laptop open, the screen bright against the dim room. My parents had never been people who turned on more lights than necessary. My mother stood just behind him, one hand pressed over her mouth in a way that told me she'd already half-guessed something before I'd said a single word. Delphine appeared in the doorway from the living room, still in the cardigan she'd worn to dinner, looking between the three of us with the particular confusion of someone who'd walked into the middle of a story. Where's the money? My father asked. His voice was quieter than I expected, which somehow made it worse. I stood in the doorway and told him the truth, plainly, the way I'd practiced it in my head more times than I wanted to admit. It's Grandpa's account, I said. It's been in my name since I was 9. Under Connecticut law, custodianship ends automatically when the beneficiary turns 21. I turned 21 in August. It's been legally mine to manage since then. I didn't take anything that wasn't already mine. My mother's voice cracked when she spoke. You let us sit at that table tonight and offer you something, Camille. You let us believe we were still deciding this. You offered me something that was already mine, I said. I didn't correct you. I don't think that was the moment to. That's not, she started, and then stopped, because I don't think she had an ending for that sentence that would have held up. Delphine's eyes had filled again, faster this time. Cam, I really do need this. The baby's coming in 2 months. Trevor's still not. We don't have, I know, I said, and I meant it. I know you need it. That doesn't make it mine to give you. My father closed the laptop slowly, the way you close something you already know is finished. When, he said, not a full question, just the one word. The week I turned 21, I told him, months before this dinner, before you ever said the word pregnant to me, before you knew that I knew. He looked at me for a long moment, something moving across his face that I recognized as the specific expression of a man realizing a plan he'd assumed was still in motion had actually already ended weeks earlier without him. Nobody said anything for what felt like a long time. My mother pulled out a chair and sat, the way people sit after standing too long without realizing it. My father set the laptop down flat and didn't reopen it. Delphine wiped her face with her sleeve and didn't say anything else. I stood there in the doorway, waiting, I think, for someone to say something that would tell me what came next. Nobody did. So after a moment, I turned and went back toward the stairs, the same way I had an hour earlier, except this time the house behind me was completely silent instead of pretending everything was fine. I didn't go back to my apartment that night. By the time I came back downstairs 20 minutes later to get my bag, my mother was sitting alone at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea poured, one clearly meant for me. "Sit with me for a minute," she said. Not an order, almost a request. I sat. My father had gone upstairs to be alone with whatever he was feeling, and Delphine had gone home, and it was just the 2 of us in a kitchen that had felt, an hour earlier, like the sight of something irreversible. "I owe you an apology," my mother said. She wasn't crying, which surprised me. She looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. "I think we told ourselves a story about you being fine with this before we ever gave you a chance to say whether you were." "I wasn't fine with it," I said. "I just didn't think yelling about it at the table would have changed anything." "No," she agreed. "I don't think it would have." She asked eventually, quiet and a little embarrassed, whether I'd really had the account moved for months. I told her yes, since spring. She nodded slowly, recalculating something, some version of events she now had to discard. "Your grandfather would have done exactly what you did," she said finally. "He never let anyone move faster than he was ready to let them." I let myself believe in that kitchen that this was the end of it, that the account was settled, that Delphine and Trevor would find another way through the next few months, the way people generally do. I drove home a little after midnight feeling something close to peace. Not happiness, but the relief of a fight actually being over instead of merely paused. For several weeks, that peace mostly held. My mother texted more than usual, small things, a recipe, a photo of Miles at the park. My father called once, awkwardly, mostly to ask about my LSAT prep. I went to a baby shower for Delphine in early November and didn't think even once about the group chat or the bank. I remember driving home thinking, with something like relief, that this really was just going to be a hard year that eventually became a story we told at holidays. I want to be honest that I believed that. I wasn't performing forgiveness I didn't feel. I genuinely thought it was over. The first thread that unraveled the piece came in early December, almost 2 months after that Saturday night in the kitchen, and it came from Delphine, not from either of my parents. She called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual by itself. We mostly texted, and phone calls between us tended to happen only around birthdays or genuine emergencies. She sounded strange, a little too careful, the way people sound when they've rehearsed an opening line and are trying to make it sound spontaneous. "Can I ask you something?" she said, "and you won't be mad." I told her she could ask, so I couldn't promise the second part without knowing what it was. "Do you know anything about an account Dad has? Like a joint one, from when you were in high school?" She said it fast, like getting it out quickly might make it land softer. "Mark mentioned something. Mark's the loan officer helping us with the apartment refinance. He pulled some old paperwork for the mortgage application, and there was a reference to an account that had your name on it, but it wasn't the one from Grandpa. Something from years ago." I sat very still on my end of the call. "There's a joint account," I said slowly. "My name and Dad's. He opened it when I was 16, for SAT prep and application fees. I don't really use it." "Okay," Delphine said, and I could hear her trying to sound casual and not quite managing it. "It's just, Mark said there had been some withdrawals on it over the years that seemed kind of large for a high school kid's college fund, and I don't know. I just thought that was weird, and I didn't want to bring it up to Mom and Dad without asking you first, in case it was nothing." I told her it was probably nothing. I told her I'd look into it, mostly to end the conversation gracefully, and we talked for a few more minutes about the baby, who'd arrived 3 weeks earlier, a girl, Ivy, 7 pounds 2 ounces, currently going through a stretch of not sleeping that Delphine described with the particular exhausted humor of new parents everywhere. But after we hung up, I sat on my couch for a long time without turning on the television or doing anything else, turning that word over in my head. Withdrawals, plural. I genuinely never looked closely at that account. It had simply existed quietly, in the background of my financial life since I was 16, a joint account I'd never had reason to check because I'd never had reason to distrust it. I opened my banking app that night and logged into an account I hadn't accessed directly in years. The account had been quiet so long that logging in felt like opening a storage unit I'd forgotten I was paying for. The interface was outdated, and it took a few tries to remember the login. I'd changed it once, years ago, to something I could actually recall and never touched it again. The balance was small, a few $100s, matching what I remembered. I'd used it exactly twice, once for an SAT prep deposit, once for an application fee, and otherwise let it sit. What I hadn't done, not once in 6 years, was look at the full transaction history. The bank only displayed 24 months online, so I requested an extended statement, which took a business day to generate. I spent that day at work distracted in a way I hadn't been in months. The statement arrived the next evening. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, the same kind my grandfather had used at his, and went through 6 years of transactions line by line. Most of it was exactly what I expected. But scattered through it, spaced unevenly across the years, were 4 withdrawals that didn't belong to any purchase I remembered making. Each was a few $1,000s. Each was logged in the bank's own description field, with some version of the phrase school expenses. I wrote the dates on the legal pad: March, the year I was 17, August, the year I was 19, February, the year I was 20, and one more, September, only 14 months earlier, after I'd already turned 21, after the custodial account had already legally become mine. Around the exact time, I realized with a slow, cold feeling that my mother had been typing that message to my aunt. I didn't recognize any of these as things I'd spent money on. I hadn't taken an SAT course in March of senior year. I'd taken it the previous fall. I sat with the dates a long time, trying to find an innocent explanation. Then, I remembered the wedding deposit, the one that vanished from what my mother called the emergency fund. Delphine's engagement to Trevor had been announced the spring I turned 19. The deposit disappeared, I remembered overhearing, that August, the same month as the second withdrawal on my list. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that. 4 dates circled in blue ink, feeling something different from what I'd felt reading the group chat message 8 months earlier. That had been recognition. This felt like the floor of a house I'd already renovated, once giving way beneath a section I'd thought was solid. I didn't call anyone that night, not Bertram, not Delphine, and certainly not my parents. I sat with the legal pad for a long time, and then I did the thing I'd apparently trained myself to do without quite realizing it. I started building a file. I cross-referenced the withdrawal dates against everything I could reconstruct about my sister's life during those years. The March withdrawal, when I was 17, lined up with a stretch of time I remembered my parents being tense and tight-lipped, though I'd never known why. I texted an old family friend, carefully, framing it as harmless nostalgia. She mentioned without much weight that she thought Delphine had needed some kind of medical procedure that year, something not covered by insurance. I didn't ask for more. I already had enough of a shape. The August withdrawal, 19, matched the wedding deposit I already knew about firsthand. The February withdrawal, 20, I couldn't place for weeks. It was only later, going back through old texts, that I found a message from my mother that month. Delphine's a little stressed about some bills right now. Please be gentle with her if you talk this week. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. The kind of message my mother sent fairly often. Generic and slightly guilt-inducing, priming me to be careful around my sister without ever explaining why. The September withdrawal, the most recent, after my 21st birthday, after the custodial account was already legally mine. I couldn't place with certainty either, but the timing was close enough to the group chat message that I couldn't stop thinking about it. I thought about simply confronting my parents, but I kept coming back to something Bertram had said, almost offhand. People rarely change their behavior when confronted with an accusation. Only when confronted with evidence they can't argue their way around. An accusation invites a defense. A printed statement, dates circled, invites something closer to silence. So I decided to wait and gather more first. I requested the full 6 years of statements on paper, wanting to see the account in its complete original form. I also looked into whether I could request the paperwork for how the account had originally been opened, curious whether my signature was actually on any of it, or whether my father had simply added my name as a formality. It took another 2 weeks for everything to arrive. I spent that time behaving, outwardly, exactly like someone with nothing on her mind. I went to Delphine's for Ivy's 1-month photos. I let my mother talk me through a recipe over the phone. I said nothing, and I waited, and I read everything twice when it finally came. The paper statements arrived first. 6 years of my financial life reduced to columns of numbers. They confirmed everything the digital summary had shown, with one addition, a 5th withdrawal, only $600 that hadn't shown up in the 24-month digital window because it was older, from the very first year the account existed, when I was 16. I hadn't caught it because it was close enough to my SAT prep deposit that I'd assumed, at a glance, it was a duplicate. It wasn't. The dates were 3 weeks apart. The description field said something slightly different. Not school expenses, but family emergency. I sat with that phrase a long time. I was 16. Delphine was 20. The year she briefly moved out to live with a boyfriend I'd never liked. A relationship that ended within a few months in a way nobody in my family ever discussed in detail. I didn't know what $600 had covered. I only knew it hadn't covered anything of mine. The account opening paperwork took longer to arrive, and when it did, it answered a question I hadn't fully let myself ask. My signature wasn't on it, only my father's. Standard for an adult opening a joint account on behalf of a minor. But further down the form, a line for the named minor's acknowledgement of purpose, and next to it, in my father's handwriting, not mine, for Camille's college-related expenses. I hadn't written that. I hadn't agreed to it. Not because I disagreed with the purpose, but because I'd never been asked. My father had opened an account, put my name on it, written down what it was for, and never once in 6 years told me the withdrawals weren't actually for that. I called Bertram again that week, mostly to ask a technical question, whether there was any meaningful legal difference between a UTME account like my grandfather's and an ordinary joint account like this one. A joint account, he told me, doesn't carry the same fiduciary restrictions. Legally, either name on it can generally use the funds for any purpose. It wasn't theft the way the custodial withdrawal attempt would have been. It was something else, a much quieter kind of wrongness. Not a law broken, exactly, but a promise. Unspoken, but implied by every description field. Broken 4 or 5 times over 6 years without me ever being told. I didn't feel the same cold shock I'd felt with the group chat message, or the same floor drop over the 4 dates on my legal pad. What I felt now was quieter, and in its own way worse. The exhausted clarity of finally seeing the entire shape of something I'd only ever felt in fragments. I sat with everything for almost 3 weeks before I decided what to do with it. Part of that delay was practical. The holidays were approaching, and I didn't want whatever conversation this became to collide with Christmas. Didn't want my niece's first holiday season permanently associated, in family memory, with whatever this turned into. Part of it was something else, something closer to grief, though I didn't fully recognize it as grief at the time. I think what I was actually doing in those 3 weeks was saying goodbye to a version of my family that I now understood had never really existed in the shape I'd believed it did. Not the family that loved me unevenly, which I'd already made peace with months earlier in that kitchen with my mother's tea going cold across the table. This was different. This was a family family that had, in some small, sustained way, been quietly spending money that had my name on it and telling me nothing for 6 years, while still coming to every cross-country meet, still making my lunch, still being, in every way I could see or measure, day to day, exactly the parents I thought I had. Both things were true at once. That was the part that took the longest to sit with. I decided, eventually, on the same principle Bertram had given me the first time around: evidence, not accusation. I organized everything into a second folder, separate from the one I'd used in September. Copies of all 5 withdrawals highlighted. A copy of the account opening form with the purpose line circled. A simple, unemotional timeline I'd typed up myself, matching dates to what I now believed each withdrawal had actually funded, where I had enough information to guess with any confidence. I called my mother in early January and asked if I could come by on a Saturday to talk about something. She asked what it was about, and I told her, honestly, that I'd rather discuss it in person. There was a pause on the line, longer than I expected, and I wondered briefly whether some part of her already knew, the way parents sometimes seem to know a conversation is coming before they've been given any real reason to. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "I think so," I said, which was true in the sense that I meant it. I wasn't in crisis. I wasn't in danger. Nothing about my life was falling apart. I just needed them to see something I'd already seen. She said Saturday worked and asked if I wanted her to make anything, the way she always did, food being the family's default language for both celebration and crisis alike. I told her not to worry about it. I think, looking back, she probably made something anyway. She almost always did. I drove over that Saturday with the second folder on the passenger seat in almost exactly the same spot the first folder had ridden 4 months earlier, and I noticed the symmetry of it without quite knowing what to do with the feeling that came with noticing. My mother had in fact made something. A coffee cake, still warm, sitting on a cooling rack when I walked in, the smell filling the kitchen the way it always had on weekend mornings throughout my childhood. My father was at the table already, reading glasses pushed up into his hair, a section of the newspaper folded in front of him that I don't think he was actually reading. Delphine wasn't there. I'd asked my mother when we spoke on the phone to keep this one just the 3 of us, at least at first, and she'd agreed without asking why. We sat. My mother poured coffee. For a few minutes, we talked about nothing. Ivy's sleep schedule, a coworker of my mother's who was retiring, the unusually mild January we'd been having. I let the small talk run its course rather than cutting it short, partly out of habit, partly, I think, because some part of me wanted one more ordinary few minutes with them before the conversation changed. Eventually, there was a natural pause, the kind that happens in every conversation, a small silence waiting to be filled with either more small talk or something else. I set my coffee cup down. "I found some things," I said, with the joint account, the one from when I was 16. My father's expression didn't change immediately, which I noticed, and which told me something before he'd said a single word. My mother's hand, halfway to her own cup, stopped moving. "What kind of things?" my father said. Not quite a question, more like a man buying himself a few seconds to decide how to answer one. I opened the folder. I laid the copies out on the table one at a time, not as an accusation, but as a sequence of facts that could speak for themselves. The 5 withdrawals highlighted, the account opening form, the purpose line circled in the same blue ink I'd used on my legal pad, a simple timeline, dates on the left, my best understanding of what each withdrawal had likely funded on the right. My father looked at the papers for a long time without touching them. My mother had gone very still, her coffee cup forgotten, one hand pressed flat against the table. "This account has my name on it," I said. "You opened it when I was 16 and wrote that it was for my college expenses. I never signed anything saying that was true. I never agreed to it. I just trusted that it was." My father finally spoke, his voice lower than I'd heard in months. "Camille, some of this was genuinely for emergencies. Your sister needed—" "I know what she needed," I said. "I'm not asking whether she needed it. I'm asking why it came out of an account with my name on it described as school expenses without me ever being told." My mother made a small sound, not quite a word. "We always meant to explain eventually. The timing was never—" "6 years," I said. 5 withdrawals. The timing was never right 5 separate times." My father picked up the account opening form, looking at his own handwriting like he was seeing it for the first time in years. "I thought that as long as it eventually helped the family, it didn't matter whose name was technically on it. We were never trying to steal from you, Camille. We were trying to help your sister without you having to know how much she needed it. We thought we were protecting both of you." "You weren't protecting me," I said. "You were quietly spending money with my name attached to it and calling that protection, because I never found out until now." The kitchen went quiet in a way that felt different from the silence 4 months earlier. That silence had felt like an ending. This one felt like the room recalibrating. Everyone in it forced to hold 2 versions of the same 6 years at once. The version where they were simply a family helping each other through hard times, and the version, now sitting in blue highlighted rows on the table, where I had been the source of that help without ever being asked or told or thanked. My mother finally looked up. "What do you want us to say?" "I don't need you to say anything specific," I said. "I need you to understand that I know now. All of it. Not just the fund from Grandpa. This too." My father set the form back down, carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid might break further if handled wrong. Neither of them said the word sorry, not in that moment. What I remember most clearly is his face. Not angry, not defensive anymore, just tired in a way that made him look, for the first time in my life, genuinely old. Delphine found out 3 days later. My mother called her, apparently wanting to be the one to tell her rather than let her hear it secondhand, and Delphine called me that same evening, her voice tight in a way I hadn't heard since we were teenagers. "I didn't know," she said, before I'd even finished saying hello. "Cam, I swear to God I didn't know it was your account. I thought I don't know what I thought. I never asked where any of it came from. I just took whatever they gave me and said thank you and moved on. I told her I believed her, which was true. Whatever my parents had done, I'd never once believed Delphine had orchestrated any of it, or even fully understood it. She'd been the recipient of a kindness she had no reason to question, the same way I'd spent years being the source of one I'd never been told about. I want to pay some of it back, she said. Not all at once. I can't do all at once, but something. It matters to me that you know I mean that. I told her I appreciated it, and that we could talk about the specifics another time, when it wasn't the same week as everything else. She asked quietly whether this changed things between us, whether I still wanted to be around for Ivy the way I had been. That's not the same thing, I said. None of this is Ivy's fault, and none of it is really yours either. I'm not angry at you, Delphine. I'm angry at how quietly all of it happened. She was crying by the end of the call, and I let her. And I didn't try to fix it or rush her out of it because I understood, in a way I hadn't fully understood before that week, that she'd been shaped by the same house I had, just from a different position inside it. Never quite told the full truth either. Just handed a different set of comfortable assumptions to live inside. I still see my parents. That surprises some people when I tell this story out loud, the way it surprised me a little too in the months right after. We're not the family we were before any of this. I don't think we could be, and I'm not sure I'd want us to be exactly the way we were, given what I now know about what that version of us actually cost. But my mother texts me recipes still. My father asks about the LSAT, and then, once I'd taken it, about law school. And now, about the job I finally landed at a firm 2 towns from where I grew up. We go to dinner sometimes, just the two of them and me, at a restaurant instead of their kitchen table, which feels to me like a small and deliberate kind of honesty. Neutral ground, nobody's history baked into the walls. Delphine paid back $4,000 over the following year, in amounts she could actually manage, and I let her. And I never once brought up the rest of it, because I understood by then that the number was never really the point. My grandfather's letter is still folded into the back of that old journal. I take it out sometimes, not often, just to reread the part where he wrote, in handwriting steadier than mine has ever been, that this money is for Camille, and no one else's name is on it. He knew something about our family, I think, that it took me 22 years and a forgotten laptop login to fully understand myself. I didn't break anything that Saturday in January. I just stopped agreeing to be the only one who never asked questions.